It's 1942. In the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin finally comes face to face with his wartime ally, Winston Churchill.
What did you do with all the rich peasants, the kulaks?
And it isn't always a meeting of minds.
Мы их перебили.
Carefully sourced from previously classified archival material, this is the story of a clash of values.
How many thousands of its citizens has the Soviet Union butchered? And quite clearly, for the moment, there's nothing to be done.
While Stalin grows ever more suspicious, imprisoning those who fraternized too closely with his Western allies.
How could I be guilty? Of what? Of loving someone? I loved a man. Who did I harm?
The Western leaders knew Stalin was a tyrant.
The president recognizes that the world is not yet perfect.
The question was, how could they work with this tyrant to win the war?
It's most unfortunate that you and President Roosevelt haven't been able to meet.
This is World War II, behind closed doors. On the 28th of June 1942, the Germans launched a massive offensive across the steppes of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Blue. Within 4 weeks, the Germans had pushed 500 miles east, further into Soviet territory.
After all, it was up to us to take the initiative. We determined the proceedings, while the Russians tried to find a way out of their dilemma. And I can only say that we were inspired by the belief and conviction that we would succeed in whatever we did.
The German force was split in two. Army Group B headed towards Stalingrad on the River Volga, whilst Army Group A advanced southeast towards the oil fields of the Caucasus. For Hitler, this oil was one of the greatest prizes of the war in the East. Which is why Nikolai Baibakov was called to an urgent meeting with Stalin, shortly after the Germans had launched their massive summer offensive.
I had about 5 meetings with Stalin before that one. Stalin made a very big impression on me. I don't know if I was afraid or not, but I felt a great respect for him.
Nikolai Baibakov was one of the Soviet Union's top oil engineers, and Stalin had a special task in mind for him.
Товарищ Байбаков, нужно сделать все, чтобы ни один грамм нефти не достался немцам. Имейте в виду, если вы оставите немцам хоть 1 тонну нефти, мы вас расстреляем. Но если вы уничтожите промыслы раньше времени, а немец их так и не захватит, мы вас тоже расстреляем.
Perhaps I would have said the same thing if I was in his place. The Caucasus was a key issue. The end justifies the means.
As the Germans advanced towards the Caucasus and Stalingrad, they captured more than 500,000 Soviet prisoners. So confident was Hitler that he moved his headquarters to here, Vinnytsia, in Nazi-occupied Ukraine. For Hitler, the campaign in the East was a war of annihilation, fought against subhumans. And he openly talked of his epic racist plans for the new Nazi empire here in the East.
We should educate the natives just to be able to read road signs, so they can get out of the way of our tanks.
But on the 12th of August 1942, the Soviet leadership thought help was on the way. Winston Churchill was the first British Prime Minister to visit Moscow since the Russian Revolution. But it was perhaps just as well that Churchill didn't know what Stalin had said privately about the British in 1939, when the Soviets had been friends with the Germans.
Я не люблю англичан и не доверяю им. Они хитрые и упорные противники. Английская армия слаба. И если, несмотря на это, англичане господствуют в мире, то это происходит из-за глупости других стран.
We will continue hand in hand like comrades and brothers until every vestige of the Nazi regime has been beaten into the ground.
The British delegation knew the forthcoming meeting with Stalin was likely to be difficult. As one of Churchill's generals later said, we were going into the lion's den, and we weren't going to feed him.
Let's start.
The Soviets had been demanding the Western Allies launch an immediate invasion of France, a so-called Second Front, to take the pressure off the Red Army. But Churchill carried bad news.
I wish to speak frankly and would like to invite complete frankness in return. The British and American governments do not feel themselves able to undertake a major operation in September.
The British minutes describe Stalin as looking very glum at this point. Churchill sought to lighten his mood with plans of how the British could still help.
We hope to shatter 20 German cities, as we have shattered Cologne, Lübeck, Dusseldorf, and so on. More and more aeroplanes and bigger bombs. If need be, as the war goes on, we hope to shatter almost every dwelling in every German city.
Later in the war, Churchill sought to distance himself from the deliberate bombing of civilian targets. But in the meeting with Stalin, he was enthusiastic about the campaign, saying, "We seek no mercy, and will show no mercy." Churchill's remarks about the bombing made the atmosphere in the meeting, according to the British minutes, progressively more cordial. something that was further helped by Churchill's news that there would be a sort of second front after all. Just not where Stalin had expected it.
We will seize the north coast of French Africa, the whole of it. 250,000 men have been set aside for this purpose.
Да поможет вам Бог в этом.
But the atmosphere worsened the next day. Stalin sent Churchill a note accusing the British of breaking an alleged promise to mount a second front in 1942 and taking action that prejudices the plan of the Soviet command. The mood was grim, something that wasn't reflected on the newsreels.
There's not the slightest doubt that the President of the Council of the People's Commissars, in other words, Joseph Stalin, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill got on tremendously well. It could hardly be otherwise between two men of such outstanding experience and ability.
Off-screen, there was yet another subject of disagreement. The Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union had suffered severe losses and had recently been postponed. Something Stalin was still sore about when he dined with Churchill on the last day of the British visit.
Может быть, английский военно-морской флот не имеет чувства гордости?
You must take it from me that what was done was right. I really do know a lot about the Navy and Sea War.
Значит, я ничего не понимаю в этом.
Russia is a land animal. The British are sea animals.
Churchill still tried to form a personal bond with Stalin, even though the two of them had virtually nothing in common.
Have the stresses of this war been as difficult for you personally as carrying through the policy of collective farms?
Войны так же тяжелы для вас лично, как и проведение коллективизации.
О нет, это было особо тяжело.
What did you do with all the rich peasants, the kulaks?
Как вы поступили с кулаками?
Мы их перебили.
Mr. Stalin says we killed them.
In the face of Stalin's admission that the Soviets had committed acts of mass killing before the war, Churchill passed no judgment. He later explained that, with the World War going on all round us, it seemed vain to moralize aloud. But the moral questions about dealing with Stalin were about to reach a point where they couldn't be ignored. In 1939, the Soviets had imprisoned several thousand Polish officers. Now, nearly 3 years later, these people seemed to have disappeared. It was a mystery that understandably obsessed the many Polish soldiers who were serving in the British Army. General Anders, commander of the Polish Second Corps, caught up with Winston Churchill when he stopped over in Cairo on his way back home after the meeting with Stalin.
Chciałbym zwrócić uwagę pana premiera na fakt zaginięcia wielkiej ilości naszych zawodowych oficerów, którzy byli uwięzieni w Rosji Sowieckiej. Nie udało mi się uzyskać żadnych wiadomości o nich.
It may be that the Russians are averse to letting the officers go for fear of the stories they might spread about their treatment in Russia.
Nie ma żadnego poczucia sprawiedliwości ani honoru w Rosji Sowieckiej. Ani żadnego człowieka w tym kraju, którego słowu można by wierzyć.
Well, I must say, General, it would be very dangerous to use such language in public. No good can come of antagonizing the Russians.
Churchill tried to keep a careful balance between Poland and the Soviet Union. He knew he needed Stalin's help to beat the Nazis, but he was also well aware that Britain had gone to war in order to protect Polish independence.
Let me say that it is my hope and belief that Poland will emerge from this war a strong and a happy country.
Meantime, the soldiers of German Army Group B neared their goal.
We were going through a really euphoric phase. Suddenly, like a surprise, there was a broad silver ribbon, the Volga. And we all knew that this was the place we had to reach. This was the goal. This was possibly the ultimate goal of the war, to get as far as the Volga. And beyond the Volga, to the east, we saw the vast, deep forests stretching to the horizon, shrouded in mystery.
Geheimnis umwittert.
It was an impressive and imposing sight, standing on the borders of Asia, saying, "We are standing at the Volga." And at that point, we were totally confident of victory.
Stalingrad!
The city of Stalingrad, along the western bank of the Volga, stood in the Germans' way. So at the end of August 1942, they started bombing it to rubble.
Bombing started at 10 in the morning, and we saw a large number of planes flying over. The planes were dropping bombs into the center of the city. Everything was ablaze. There was noise and screaming. Some people managed to get back to their ruined homes. It was Stalin's order not to surrender Stalingrad. There was constant fear that we felt. We wanted to survive the war. We were just always wondering where to get food. We were constantly hungry.
As the Red Army struggled to hold Stalingrad, the Soviet leadership increasingly felt the Western Allies were not doing enough to help. And they were now so bitter that they allowed open ridicule of their allies to appear in the Soviet press. Boris Yefimov, a newspaper cartoonist, did his best to capture the mood of the country. A suspicion that the Western Allies were just standing by and letting the Soviet Union and the Nazis bleed each other to death.
My feeling about Churchill was the common one, that he was seen as a man who was very difficult to trust.
In this cartoon, Yefimov suggested the British were lazy and almost guilty of cowardice. It shows 7 fat British generals with names like General Don't Hurry, General What If We Get Beaten, and so on. Opposite them is the figure of Winston Churchill, and next to him, 2 bottles of whiskey.
It was just his personal characteristic. Everyone knew that Churchill started every morning by drinking a large measure of whiskey. I'm sure the cartoon could not have been published without Stalin's permission.
Stalin.
2 But in the West, Stalin was increasingly portrayed as a hero. In the United States, Time magazine put Stalin on the cover as Man of the Year for 1942. The citation concluded, Stalin's methods were tough, but they paid off. And Life magazine, a few months later, described Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, as a national police similar to the FBI.
Too many people had too many rosy spectacles, views of Stalin, and the American people, the public at large, were quite unaware of the Soviet purges and of the relocation of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. It was necessary for the American leadership, the government, the president, to have a sense of realism about the Soviet Union. The public at large, it was not really essential for the public at large to know that.
Why not?
We've got to win the war. That's what counted.
But during the war, here in the port of Molotovsk, lived some Americans who knew the truth about Stalin's regime. They were Allied sailors, waiting here in the north of the Soviet Union for return convoys to form. They saw how much of the work in the city was performed by political prisoners, and the Soviet authorities didn't try to hide how they were treated. One day, several American sailors stood here and watched as a column of prisoners marched by.
This cigarette was thrown on the ground, and this political prisoners in the line of march stepped out to pick it up, to smoke it, and he was killed. He was shot by the guard. And he was left to lie there. That was the thing that got me more than anything else. Dead and just lying there on the side of the street, on the side of the walk. By then we had learned that Stalin was a brute, just like Hitler was a brute. They were just brutes in a different language.
Brutal as he was, Stalin was beginning to show that he might be capable of leading the Soviet Union to victory. Previously, he had scarcely listened to the advice of his generals, often with disastrous results. But now, all that was changing.
Хорошо. Я согласен с вашим планом.
On the 19th of November 1942, more than 1 million Red Army soldiers took part in Operation Uranus, an ambitious attempt to cut off the German army in Stalingrad. It was a triumph. Not only were the Germans on the verge of defeat in Stalingrad, but they had to pull back from their advance towards the oil fields of the Caucasus as well. Here in Stalingrad, as the Red Army pushed forward into the city, they came across the few civilians who had survived in the ruins.
One of the soldiers opened the doors to our room. My brother shouted out, "Don't kill us, we're Russians." The soldier said to the others, "Lads, the kids are in here." When they saw us, they started crying.
Valentina Krutova and her brother were lucky. The death toll at Stalingrad was immense. Even today, the spring thaw brings new bones from the earth in the fields around the city. Around 500,000 Red Army soldiers died here. More people than the British lost in the whole of the war. Yet Stalin saw little sign of the long-awaited Second Front. and though Western aid via the convoys was now increasing, Stalin still believed that his allies didn't really care about the extent of the Soviet sacrifice. The atmosphere was so bad that the British ambassador to Moscow even suggested that Stalin might make a separate peace with the Nazis if the Soviets weren't given more help. And now the Soviet relationship with the West was about to be tested further, almost, indeed, to breaking point. On the 13th of April 1943, the Germans announced to the world a discovery they had made here in the forest of Katyn, near Smolensk in central Russia.
Und schon werden übereinander gestapelt wie Tuchballen die Stiefel toter Soldaten sichtbar. Dann werden grauenvoll entstellte Körper und Köpfe freigelegt. Ermordete Offiziere. Sie wurden seit Jahren von der polnischen Bevölkerung vermisst.
They had found the mass graves of several thousand of the missing Polish officers, and they eagerly showed off the evidence.
The stench was bad. When we came, the Germans were removing a layer of earth about a meter thick. And then there were coats, bodies and coats, lying there in a row. And they were feeling these bodies, checking the pockets, removing flasks, removing watches. And the Germans set up a museum further out. The Germans wanted witnesses. They wanted us to act as witnesses for history.
These were the remains of about 4,000 of the 20,000 Polish officers and others thought dangerous to the Soviet regime, who had been missing since April 1940. In March 1940, Stalin and other leading members of the Politburo had signed the document which led to the murders, though the Soviets officially denied they had committed the crime until 1990. As well as the Polish officers, Stalin had wanted other leading citizens of occupied Poland to be murdered at the same time, like Mikhailo Griniev, a prominent lawyer of Ukrainian descent.
He was an extremely kind man, and I'm not just saying this because he was my father. This was his nature. I felt very sorry for my father. Having a Western European legal education, he would not have found it possible to have conceived such a crime.
И какую-то юридическую. Но непосредственные исполнители.
Well, of course, the people who did this were cruel and remorseless people, but they were not the main perpetrators. The main perpetrators were in the Central Committee of the party. They were the ones who committed the crime to top all crimes, as the Poles would call it. They were the ones who tried to cover it all up.
In 1943, here at the Foreign Office in London, a British diplomat wrote a report that suggested that the Soviet Union had indeed been responsible for the mass killings at Katyn, something that resulted in a series of anxious memos in response from some of the most senior officials at the Foreign Office.
Well, gentlemen, it is obviously an awkward matter when fighting for a moral cause that our allies are open to accusations of this kind. It is our intention to deal with war criminals.
Yes. I confess that in a cowardly fashion I had rather turn my head away from the scene at Katyn for fear of what I should find there. I think no one has pointed out that on a purely moral plane this is not new. How many thousands of its citizens has the Soviet Union butchered? And quite clearly for the moment there's nothing to be done.
Neither the British nor the American governments wanted to know too much about the war crime committed here in the forest of Katyn near Smolensk. And if their ally Joseph Stalin had ordered the murders, they preferred the world not to know. Churchill wrote in a confidential note in April 1943 that there is no use prowling morbidly round the 3-year-old graves of Smolensk. But Stalin's desire to see leading citizens of eastern Poland destroyed cast a long shadow. Boguslava Griniev never found the remains of her father. All she has is his name inscribed on her mother's grave. It was placed there after the fall of communism, when she finally learnt that he had been killed at one of the murder sites back in the spring of 1940.
I have missed him throughout my life. I've really missed my father throughout my life. I would like to say that from where I now stand at the age of 82. I do not consider the war and being deported to have been the tragedy of my life. I consider the tragedy of my life to have been my father's murder. The murder of a very just and noble man who was not charged with anything and for whom there was no justice.
Stalin blamed the Germans for the murders, and because the Poles didn't go along with his version of history, he broke off diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile. The headline in Pravda on the 19th of April 1943 read, "Hitler's Polish Collaborators," and the article accused the Polish government in exile of striking a treacherous blow at the Soviet Union. Meantime, Churchill had kept his promise to Stalin. The British and Americans had opened a kind of second front in North Africa.
The Yanks are ready. The doughboys are spread out for miles behind every tree and shrub, ready to strike the enemy or repel infiltration.
But the Western Allies were facing tougher opposition here than expected. This put into jeopardy any plans to invade France in 1943. The real second front Stalin so craved. And so Churchill travelled to Washington for a meeting with President Roosevelt in May 1943.
The Russian effort is prodigious and places us in their debt, a position from which we would like to emerge. But as I have already mentioned, the best way of taking the weight off the Russian front in 1943 is to get or knock Italy out of the war. This would force the Germans to send a large number of troops to hold down the Balkans.
With regard to taking weight off of Russia, the United Nations should continue with a strategy which compels the Germans to fight. For that reason, I question...
There was clear conflict between Britain and America over what to do next. Churchill now wanted to invade Italy, but the Americans had other ideas.
The most effective way of forcing the Germans to fight is by carrying out cross-channel operations.
The reality was that Roosevelt's relationship with Churchill was a good deal less cozy than the propaganda of the time portrayed.
Or some parts of it.
I think Churchill thought at times he was handling Roosevelt. Roosevelt was pretty confident all the time he was handling Churchill. You couldn't read Roosevelt the way you could read Churchill.
Almost at the same time as Roosevelt was trying to handle Churchill, he was doing his best to handle Stalin as well.
Thank you.
Just days before meeting Churchill, Roosevelt had written a letter to be hand-delivered to the Soviet leader.
Shall we begin?
And he had been careful to keep the contents a secret from the British.
My dear Mr. Stalin, I am sending you this personal note by the hands of my old friend Joseph E. Davies. It relates only to one subject.
Roosevelt had chosen his messenger carefully. Joseph Davis, a rich lawyer, had been American ambassador to Moscow in the 1930s. Now, accompanied by the current American ambassador, he entered Stalin's office at the same time as Churchill was visiting the American president in Washington. Davis was hugely sympathetic to Stalin and the Soviet Union.
I'm glad to present Mr. Davis to you, Mr. Stalin.
He hadn't just written a positive book about his time in Moscow. He'd also seen it recently turned into a feature film.
Mission to Moscow is my report to the American people as Ambassador of the United States to the Soviet Union. I wrote it as I saw it and lived it.
Mission to Moscow, the behind-the-scenes story of every world-shaking crisis of our day, with Walter Houston as Ambassador Davies, Anne Harding as Mrs. Davies, with a superb cast portraying Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and other world figures, reenacting for the screen the cataclysmic events which changed the entire course of human history.
Thank you.
Molotov.
Mr. Molotov. Thank you. It is vital to the war and to a post-war peace that our governments, despite ideological differences, can work together. Britain, after this war, will be financially through for a long time. So post-war peace depends on the unity of our two countries in this situation. It's most unfortunate that you and President Roosevelt haven't been able to meet. The President attaches great importance to just such a meeting, and that's why he's sent me as a special envoy to present this to you personally.
The letter invited Stalin to a private meeting with Roosevelt. And it was clear from the list of possible locations Roosevelt suggested for the encounter that the American president specifically wanted to exclude Churchill.
Идея встретиться в Исландии мне не нравится, так как для нас обоих это означает довольно тяжелый перелет. К тому же, откровенно говоря, нам будет трудно сделать это, не пригласив туда же премьер-министра Черчилля. В связи с этим я предлагаю встретиться...
Roosevelt wrote that his preferred meeting place for just the two of them would be either Siberia or Alaska.
Дело, удачи, всегда искренне ваш Франклин Делано Рузвельт.
The president
Roosevelt was desperately anxious to meet Stalin face to face without Churchill present. Then, he thought, it would be easier for him to work his magic and handle the Soviet leader.
Думаю, ваш президент прав. Он великий человек. Передайте вашему президенту, что я буду очень рад встретиться с ним.
The feature film Mission to Moscow was a mockery of the truth. It showed nothing of the fear and suspicion that really existed in Soviet society. A wrong word, a meeting with the wrong person could end in disaster.
When one tried to meet Russians, you could see they were very afraid of meeting foreigners. There was this sort of shadow over them, and one felt it the whole time. One felt desperately sorry for them.
As a member of the military mission to Moscow, Hugh Lungi always suspected that the Soviets were spying on the British. And just after the war was over, he discovered the truth.
And I thought one day that I would explore a particular part of the rooms, and every room was bugged, including our cipher room, and it was either bugged under these ventilators or in the skirting boards. We made silly noises down the microphones and said various sort of rude things, and then pulled them out. There were newspapers packing these microphones dating back to 37, 38. So obviously they'd been there all the time.
The Soviet authorities were suspicious of all foreigners, which created a huge problem for them in a place like this, Archangel, in the far north of the Soviet Union. Here it was almost impossible to stop the locals fraternizing with visiting Allied sailors, strangers who brought with them a touch of glamour. When the sailors relaxed ashore, they frequented a special club for foreigners that was built here, the International Club. Locals could only come inside by invitation, and many of those who were invited were, not surprisingly, attractive young women.
Once a week there was a dance, and I danced from 8 p.m. till 4 a.m. And at 5 in the morning I came home. I was young, I was pretty, and I had very beautiful teeth. I had wonderful lips, big eyes, and this soft rosy complexion that you can't fake and that even a photo doesn't do justice to. And this wonderful complexion made me irresistible. They showed films, and I saw really lovely films there.
Maria Montez and the beauties of the harem, in a story rich and exotic as the East itself.
Everyone was saying, "You're so beautiful. If you came to Hollywood, you'd be famous."
You will ride with me beyond the river.
I just wanted to be an actress. I had no idea whatsoever about any other life. I was very young and I was thoughtless.
Valentina loved everything she discovered about American culture, from the films to the food.
А уж когда ходят домой, то приносят с собой.
If they came to your home, they brought you soup, canned meat, sausage, whatever they had. Even biscuits. I remember there were biscuits. I'll remember it forever.
Даже печенье.
There was peanut butter in those biscuits. They were so delicious.
Intoxicated by all things American, Valentina fell in love with a sailor from Brooklyn.
He said, "We're married. You're my wife, I'm your husband." And that was it. Later, he sent me letters from America, from Brooklyn. He didn't know I was pregnant. I didn't tell him about it.
Valentina's relationship with the American sailor was an example of just what Stalin didn't want to happen. The Soviet Union might be allied to the West, but in the first half of 1943, Stalin's suspicion and distrust of his allies was almost boundless.
When it came to official relationships, it was an absolute freeze. It was terrible, hostile, and also the media were hostile to us. Obviously, people thought that they were not being helped because in 1943 it was the turning point, but it was a crunch point.
Back in Washington, in May 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill made a decision that they knew would anger Stalin still further. There would be no cross-channel invasion of France, no second front, until the following year, 1944. And having made the decision, the question was how to tell Stalin the bad news.
One evening when I was a lone officer in the map room on night duty, there was a tap at the door, and then a whole gaggle of people came in. The Prime Minister, the President, and the chiefs, the British and American chiefs of staff. They had to settle down and to answer this latest demand from Stalin. What are you going to do next? Sir John Dill, who was chief of the British mission in Washington, wrote drafted an evasive answer, passed it across the desk. General Marshall and Admiral Leahy did some tinkering with the words. We knew the answer would not please Stalin, and it did not.
The cable to Stalin was eventually transmitted on the 2nd of June. But the new date for the invasion of France, in the spring of 1944, appeared only at the very end of the long document.
Жуков говорит, что у него есть информация от пленных.
As everyone had predicted, Stalin was dismayed by the news. He saw it as further evidence that the Western Allies were leaving the Soviets to face the might of the German army almost on their own. And Stalin's belief was reinforced by the knowledge that in the fields around Kursk in the center of Russia, the Germans were preparing to launch another huge armored offensive. The Germans planned to commit nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns to the battle, including a number of the powerful new Panther tanks, as well as 400,000 men. Up to now, the Soviets had never defeated a German summer offensive.
Хорошо.
Both in 1941 and 1942, the German mastery of motorized warfare had been decisive once the snow had melted. Now, whether or not the Red Army could hold the Germans at Kursk became one of the most decisive questions of the whole war. Back in London, the alliance was under even more strain. Churchill had finally learnt the truth about Joseph Davis's trip to Moscow.
Господин Дэвис, садитесь, пожалуйста. Молотов.
Churchill was immensely hurt that Roosevelt had planned to exclude him from the proposed meeting with Stalin.
You must excuse me expressing myself with all the frankness that our friendship and the gravity of the issue warrant. I do not underrate the use that enemy propaganda would make of a meeting between the heads of Soviet Russia and the United States at this juncture, with the British Commonwealth and Empire excluded. It would be serious and vexatious, and many would be bewildered and alarmed by it.
On June the 28th, 1943, Roosevelt replied to Churchill, and he told a barefaced lie.
I did not suggest to Uncle Joe that we meet alone, but he told Davies that he assumed, A, that we would meet alone, and B, he agreed not to bring staffs.
This was simply untrue. The suggestion that Churchill be excluded came not from Stalin, but from the Americans.
It's most unfortunate that you and President Roosevelt haven't been able to meet.
All this deception came to nothing. Stalin now refused to meet Roosevelt because he thought the West still wasn't helping the Soviet Union enough. The battle at Kursk began on July the 5th, 1943. It was an epic encounter. More than 2.5 million troops fought across an area nearly the size of Belgium. The Germans were strong, but the Red Army was stronger.
Achtung, feindliche Tiefflieger! Auseinander!
At Kursk, thanks to better equipment, advanced knowledge of the German plans and improved battlefield tactics, the Red Army forced the Germans back.
It wasn't until then that we truly understood how strong the Russians were. One didn't want to believe it before, but now the pessimistic view was the war was lost. It was over.
But just as at Stalingrad, the victory was bought at massive cost. Nearly 200,000 Soviets were killed.
If they had opened the Second Front in 1943, the Kursk battle might have been avoided. Our losses might well have been less. For the sake of justice, they should have opened the Second Front at least a little earlier.
The Western Allies, who hadn't felt in a position to mount the Second Front before, had now committed to a cross-channel attack in 1944. American soldiers soon flooded into Britain in preparation for the biggest amphibious offensive ever attempted, an operation that would become known as D-Day. But Stalin's suspicions about the intentions of his Western allies remained. Indeed, they were growing. As back in Archangel, someone who loved all things American would eventually find out to her cost.
I was accused of being a spy for 2 different intelligence services. My investigator kept on saying, "Tell me about your spying activities," and I just kept smiling at him.
Valentina dreamt of a future as an actress in the United States, living with her American boyfriend. The Soviet secret police had discovered her diary, in which she had written, "I want to go to America so much. There, you only have to be beautiful."
How could I be guilty? Of what? Of loving someone? I loved life. I loved a man, so what was wrong with that? That's what I said to him eventually. Who did I harm? Who did I do harm to? The only person I harmed was myself.
Valentina's mistake had been to fall in love with an American. She was sentenced to 6 years in a gulag. She was not to be the only victim of Stalin's growing mistrust of the West. As preparations for D-Day advance, Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill meet together for the first time and argue over the future shape of Europe.
Будьте осторожны. Ошибочно думать, что русские настолько наивны, что не видят того, что происходит у них под носом.
While Stalin's secret policemen perpetrate one of the biggest and most cynical cover-ups in the history of the 20th century.